Hello, my name is Paulo Moratelli. I am a Brazilian psychologist. I am a facilitator, consultant, speaker, and instructor of restorative justice. I am an international delegate for Brazil of the Sociedade Científica de Justiça Restaurativa from Spain and a member of Global Advisory Council of Restorative Justice International from USA. I lead a group of professionals from various fields here in Brazil, and we use the method we call transformative dialogues, which I developed as a way of preventing, mediating, and transforming conflicts and crimes. Transformative dialogues are structured dialogue processes focused on emotions and relationships, which create a safe space capable of sustaining difficult dialogues about complex and or conflicting situations in search of a consensual and prospective definition of problem situation, in addition to generate internal engagement and cohesion in groups and teams. Our proposal is not limited and intended to restore person and relationships, but to create spaces where these people can transform themselves, their relationships, institutions, and finally, the very way we live in society. A look of profound social transformation. Thus, we prefer to call what we do transformative justice, which would be an approach of justice as a universal human value, which seeks to pay attention to the parties directly and indirectly involved in a conflict or crime, so that these participants collectively identify the harms and the needs arising from these, in order to, through individual and collective self-responsibility, seek a broader reparation of these harms. At the same time, it seeks to identify the causes of the conflict or crime and build action plans with measures to prevent its recurrence and, when appropriate, collaborate forgiveness and reconciliation. We use dialogical methods of prevention, resolution, and voluntary self-composing consensual transformation of conflicts and crimes in order to transform those persons, their relationships, communities, and laws, creating the basis for more respectful, healthy, and harmonious relationships. We use an integrative vision proposed by Félix Guattari, the ecosophy, which would be a union from a philosophical point of view of the three distinct types of ecology, namely the ecology of nature, environment, social, of relationships, and the personal, inferior, subjectivity. By adopting this philosophical principle, we understand that the integration between environmental, social, and interpersonal systems exactly made up for our field of action in conflicting situations, relationships. And so, only through this expanded, systemic, and holographic look can we collaborate not only to resolve these conflicts, but for the true transformation. Transformation of the persons in conflict, personal ecology, transformation of the relationships between these people and between their relationships with the community and society in general, ecology of relationships, and transformation of the physical space, of the institution, of the very reality where and how these people live, ecology of the environment. In our work, which is very influenced by the ideas of Terry O'Connell, among others, we have the following assumptions and premises. Each human being is the great expert in his own life. Therefore, the answers to the dilemmas can be and must be found with the own person, with the person. Relationships are the center of human experience of our life. Everything that creates conditions for good relationships favors life and learning. And the why of our practice matters much more than what we do. Today, I'm going to talk about the use of the transformative dialogues in cases of gender violence. What's my proposal? How do we put these ideas in practice? Well, if we're going to act alongside a whole network of protection for women and to face gender violence, domestic violence, we must act in different ways. First of all, it's obvious that the aggression is already happened, We have to interrupt this violence. And for that, it's vital the operation of the police, public prosecutors, the judicial system. But we can give the victims more attention in the way of protecting them of possible harms, and also to repair the harms in a broad way. As for the offenders, they cannot remain with this aggressive manner. They need to take responsibility for their behavior. One way is to actively responsibilize them using coercive processes like police, public ministry, and etc. But we can use the transformative dialogues to create ways for their self responsibilization too. This is a process from the inside out that requires the persons to undergo a process that involves a crucial level of pedagogic learning, and it can also be therapeutic in a way that can change themselves, they can transform themselves. This transformation, this reframing, is profoundly fundamental. We must act alongside the community and the professionalized network, making them more participative and protective, also making so they learn how to deal with this and also to be able to teach the community to work in this area. And it's fundamental to change the culture, create new paradigms of coexistence, new relational standards. So, we need to change this culture, and we can do that through a concrete case, and we can also develop specific action courses for the protection, reframing, and transformation of these people. Following ahead, we can organize several meetings to victims, offenders, communities, familiar circles to victims and or to offender. If they don't recognize the concept of transformation of these conflicts from the beginning, they imagine that the objective here is to make both men and women return to their previous relation, to restore the relation, and there cannot be a more mistaken mindset. You not only not have that objective, but your greater work is to ensure that we will only be a relation if it is respectful, adequate, safe, and healthy. You need to help the victim to be able to develop new ways to be and interact with the world independently of the offender, the aggressor, so she can be empowered and safe. Very well. We can then think about these three fundamental pieces in this process: the community, the victim, and the offender. It's simplified here. There can be more than one victim or more than one offender. So, how can we act in the idea of transforming conflicts or offenses inside this dimension I'm using? I'm going to use this term transformative circles or transformative dialogues, which is in a dialogue structure of creating safe spaces where participants can reframe themselves and transform themselves, as I mentioned before. In those collective gatherings, the persons are once again protagonists to decide their own situations. Very well. What can we do then when going to those meetings? The first thing we can do is take care and give the victims attention. And it's very important that you won't force a victim to sit and talk about what they suffered. Here you should create spaces so the victim or the victims can meet and have dialogues, talk about it. I'm talking about a few basic assumptions. I'm not going to talk about how all these meetings work today. That's not my objective here, because you don't have the time for that. It's more of an initial approach for those of you that are interested in this subject. The first point then in those circles is using small groups of max 5, 7, or 8 people, 8 victims. Why this? Because victims need a space where they can feel safe, where they can share their stories and attain empathy. It's the dimension of care of the other people who are there. So it's better to work with small groups between 5 and maybe 10 people So you have a space that should allow them to talk longer, that should allow them to connect with one another, that should allow them to share their stories. The second thing we can do would be meetings with the family of the victim, perhaps um, with the extended family and the community itself. Whomever the victim wish for a priest or a psychologist, a friend, a certain relative, whomever is fundamental to that victim so they can feel safe, feel welcome, and allow themselves to reframe their situation. You can see the victim and offender are not present in the same meeting. There is no victim offender meeting here. We can use the circles also with the offender. As you see, these circles are very similar as those with victim. Both have the objective of helping the persons to reframe themselves and rebuild their relations primarily with themselves and afterwards with the others. So there we have the objective of transforming the persons. That's the major goal we have here. So in the circles with offenders, we have the care of having few men, few people, so they can feel safe and accept that many times it's hard for them. Most of the times their fragilities, because several kinds of violence are committed because of the fragilities the person doesn't acknowledge or is ashamed to acknowledge. The subject of shame is very important in this area for the victims as well for the offenders, as well for the community, of course, as well as the family. Uh, they are going to approach, I'm not going to approach that today, sorry, because it's a very complex subject, but it's fundamental to know how to handle shame. So the offenders, therefore, will have safe space to talk amongst themselves, and it's crucial for it to be a space of dialogue amongst themselves. Those men are truly the protagonists in this moment, so they can reflect on what they've done in terms of violence, offenses, and the impact of it in their communities and in themselves, of course. Following, the next possibility would be family circles of the offender, where their micro community with the community they belong to. Again, the victim and the offender will not be together in this meeting. It's a meeting for the offender and their community, and that community can be the same or slightly different from the victim community. So it's possible some people may be in both meetings, but the major objective here is to reintegrate these persons in their community in a full way. So we have four options so far of meetings where victim and offender doesn't meet. The next option are the community dialogues. The victims and offenders won't be in those meetings. They are meetings in which you communicate with the community about what is gender violence, why it is so cruel, so bad for the victims and the whole society. So the major goal here is the cultural change, a paradigm shift. So the circles can occur in schools, churches, and healthcare units, social assistance centers, community centers, educational centers, and one of the bigger objectives here is to break the silence of the violences, make it explicit. What are those violences? How they impact the community? And show these persons that there are other possibilities of solution, coexistence. So the major goal here is to create spaces of collective learning, of transformation. Here again, you won't have the presence of the victim and the offender in the same meeting. Very well. Another option we have are these surrogate circles. There are many ways to put this into practice. Sometimes you come across one or more victims that are interested or even have the need to speak up with the offender, but it is unsafe to put them to talk with their aggressor because it could resume a relation where violence could happen again. In other words, a re-victimization. They are made for that to avoid run the risk of re-victimization. It is important that these substitutes can allow the victim a more qualified listening and feelings validation. And the offender may have the perception of empathy and otherness from what their actions provoke on others, and that is what provokes change. What produces learning is what produces transformation. So these meetings are very interesting. Let me remind everyone that I'm talking about transformative dialogue, which is a dialogical strategy that can be used individually in a meeting with only one person or in a group of people. It's meeting where everyone has a voice, but it's not simply a dialogue. There's a whole very careful internal structure to where we'll allow protagonists to the participants, because we believe that each person is the biggest expert in his own life, and that they have to identify their own answers, and that emotions are the basis for relations, and relationships are the basis of human life, and that good relationships are the most important thing in life. Very well, so this is the last possibility. It's precisely the one many times people think is the only one, which involves placing the victim, the offender, and their community in a room, in the same space, but in a safe, prepared, totally adequate, and totally organized space to offer safety. They can therefore talk about their situation, thinking about the future and permanent solutions to the issues that lead to violence, that lead to the offense. Well, these transformative circles, they have a little bit of peacemaking circles, a bit of restorative conferencing, a bit of victim offender mediation, and it has a lot of psychology in the work structure. In the work structure. That's why I say it's not a simple dialogue meeting. It has a whole structure, a series of principles coming from philosophy and psychology to take care of this space, these transformative circles. When we do normally apply them, when the person or the couple wishes to maintain the relation, when the violence was a one time thing, for example, it is not repeated, when this violence does not risk escalation to feminicide, for example. It is very important to lead a very careful evaluation in which situations it is adequate, it is safe. When the best thing to people is to put them together in a room for a safe conversation. As you can see, the victim or victim offender meeting are the exception, not the rule, and that's very important. Well, I find it rather interesting to talk about the transformative continue. In other words, we rate the transformation gradient that reaches the person, their relations, their community, their society with these formats, these meeting possibilities. So the first ones are those circles in yellow. They are partially transformative. They are fundamentally pedagogic. In other words, they create a possibility of learning from these people about their own life, to these people about their own life, to become the protagonist of their own life. And they are also therapeutic. They are not therapy, but have therapeutic results for those subjects, for those people. The change is much more in the subjective level. The circles with the family to victims or offenders and circles with surrogate victims or surrogate offenders are more transformative because they allow that pedagogic, therapeutic, learning and transformation contents and also the construction of action plans that allow the reestablishment of some relations and the reintegration of the victim and the offender and their communities. Because the more we isolate these persons, the more they find themselves at mercy of violence. The more the victim is isolated, separated from the community they belong to, the more they are at the mercy of the offender. And the more the offender is removed from the community they belong to, the more they are scared, the more unattended needs they will have, and commonly, he will act more aggressively. So we have to reintegrate the persons to their respective communities. And reintegrate doesn't mean rebuilding the husband-wife relationship, for example. And the last case, in those transformative circles, Then we have a meeting that is completely transformative because it transforms them in all the dimensions that we mentioned before. Very well. This is the perception of the intervention that I wanted to share with you today. We can never forget we have other victims, which are the children. So as we work with them, we can break the transgenerationality of this kind of violence. Well, now I just want to thank you for your attention, for be with me for these minutes, and I'm available to some answers, questions, whatever you want to me to talk with you about this transformative dialogues, restorative justice, and gender violence or other serious crimes. Thank you very much. Bye bye.